Hi. In the first 2 hours of talk on Britain and India, we primarily talked about from the early start, from the uh, spice trade started by the Portuguese, followed by the Dutch, and Spaniards already had empire. The Brits were a little late, but they got into it with all their expertise and naval power. And obviously, the French were involved as well. And the trade was granted with firman or tax-free permit by the Mughal Empire, who were not paying attention to the importance of sea route, and scramble for trade continued in as part of the global war that occurred between the French-Indian Wars, which involved Canada, Europe, and India. The French were outwitted and outgunned, and the British Empire got the foothold. And the founding took place by an enterprising young person who was not a military trained, but was a self-taught genius who established the empire initially in Bengal with the Battle of Plassey. And, and then the trade primarily involved cotton, saltpeter, and other raw materials. Okay, so that's what we summarized in the first class. Okay, now, as you recall that we talked, the port of entry was Surat, India, and Bombay was a late start based on a dowry, which was part of a marriage between Portugal and Britain. And the same city of Surat has changed dramatically in 400 years and has become a big major center for diamond refining and cotton and trade to the Middle East. And just to give you the example as to how the wealth has, one of the business houses for the New Year celebration were very generous to the employees and managed to distribute about 1,000 cars, flats, and jewelry. And so you can imagine the wealth and the profits that were being made. So the tables have been turned from the people who are starving with famines and have now become successful merchants. And this was a man who was obviously a business genius. They starting from 1992 to 2014, he's witnessed a turnover of almost $500 million. Okay, so it shows the native enterprising business skills. But I'm digressing. And finally, the younger generation, the post-war generation of Brits are just rediscovering the long history or the checkered past of East India Company. This was a recent documentary done by, obviously, the gentleman on the left, a young British reporter, who goes and looks at the charter of the East India Company, which is well documented, and he was able to view it with the assistance of the British Museum and saw the vast amount of wealth that was being generated by the empire. And while in name the company called itself the Honorable East India Company, their actions were far from honorable, and obviously, and went on to become a foundation of the British Empire around the world, and it lasted for about 250 years. But people became immensely wealthy and financed the industrial empire of which Britain was at the forefront and established colonies around the world. And at the same time, he discovered that the company was an army and a nation at the same time by itself, and employed as many as 200,000 native sepoys in its heyday. And obviously, and now just as a irony, the company's name has been revived by an expat Indian who probably came from Uganda as to and has established the patent on the name the East India Company. Okay, and obviously it's a chain of food stores trading into various items as tea, coffee, chocolates, biscuits, and it's headquartered in in a prestigious location in Mayfair, and has branches not just around in and around Britain, but in Europe, Australia, Far East, and a few in Middle East. So one can say that the empire strikes back in more than one way. Okay, so we digressed a bit, but I thought that was amusing in its own strength. Okay, continuing with the history, by this time they were rulers in all, the sense of the lucrative province of Bengal, and that was granted to them by the local Nawabs, because by that time the central authority of the Mughal king was just in names only, and he barely controlled the area surrounding Delhi because he was threatened by the rising powers of Persia, and from south the Hindu establishment of Marathas, who were called Shivajis, and for good measures from the coastal area by the East India Company. So, and obviously they required official governor general. So a gentleman whose name was well well summarized due to the famous trial that took place in the British Parliament for bribery and corruption and poor ruling. He was a middle class person who was actually quite enlightened and did a lot on his own to understand the Indian and Hindu culture. He translated the Holy Indian poem or called Bhagavad Gita from Sanskrit to English, and tried to expand the empire and managed to install some type of stability in the lawless regions, because by this time the Mughal authority was really diminished in names, and the Afghan Muslims which were settled in central India, and they were reasonable rulers, but obviously they were a challenge to the British establishment. So Warren Hastings, with the assistance of the sepoys, expelled them and took over their province. And there was another local Nawab in a state called Audh, which is in the foothills of Himalayas, and he again interfered in the ruling of that province and managed to defeat him and make him a type of a puppet. Now, obviously, when a local Nawab or Raja is defeated, he gives a huge gift and to the company as well as to the leaders who defeated them. And as part of it, he managed to secure, sort of pad his own pockets, and then the news eventually filtered to the parliament, and he was tried for and impeached in Britain. And the trial was lengthy and lasted for several years, and that is the time when Edmund Burke, who was for the opposing party, made the famous speech about "I impeach you," saying it 3 times, and he made a name for himself. And eventually, Hastings was emotionally ruined, but was acquitted to the best. But at the same time, he had obviously accomplished more in giving a stronger running start to the empire in Bengal and northeast India. Okay, moving on to the next thing. And this name may be recognizable to lots of students of American history. Yes, it's the same famous Charles Cornwallis who suffered a very decisive defeat under General Washington in October of 81. And again, and that was the almost the start of the United States. It's and almost the ending of the colonial wars. And finally, obviously, just because of defeat, he was not disgraced. He went on to varieties of important positions, starting as ambassador to the court of Frederick the Great in what later on consolidated to Germany, and that was Prussia at that time. And later on was appointed Governor General of India, which was a very respectable position. And obviously, he was an upper class military man. So that is one of the reasons why he was not chastised for the defeat. Now he saw the corruption that was going on by the factors or the employees of the East India Company, and their company was losing huge amount of revenue. And he tried to put some sort of order to this chaos that was prevalent in South India as well as Bengal. He established a uniform land assessment and fixed taxes. And at the same time, the people who were absentee landlords were sucking the farmers. And again, and by this time, the whole of India was in more or less chaos due to soldiers who had lost their employment with the Mughal Empire and were making themselves available as soldiers of fortune and were robbing the ordinary citizens and farmers. And these were called thugs, which became a word in British, incorporated in British language. And there were other freewheeling bad characters who used to gather down travelers. So Cornwallis did a substantial amount of effort in putting down some of these chaos that was prevalent at that time. Now, at the same time, he went on to establish a Sanskrit college in South India, and obviously was, as it happens to be the case, he was involved in quite a few major and minor skirmishes and wars with a character who looms large in the Indian history, which we'll talk about. He ruled a kingdom of Mysore, which is where the current headquarters of the Indian IT industry is called Bangalore. So this was a Muslim empire which had broken loose from the Mughal dynasty and was fairly successful rule in its own right, and had instituted and obviously they were trying to defend themselves from one side from the French, another side from the British, and from north from the Maratha Hindu kingdom, and in the central area kingdom, which was more Sunni, called Nizam. So there were a lot of actors who were in play in South India. If you draw a horizontal line extending from modern-day Pakistan to Calcutta, so these were the various powers to be in southern India. So, and it depended upon who had the better guns and more manpower and a better fighting techniques. So who they were going to come out on the top. And obviously the Brits were masters at that, and that explains their rise. And obviously they controlled the coast, so they were able to supply parts of the British Army, and were able to, due to their deep pockets, not just from Britain alone, but from the tax revenues that they were given, they were able to pay regularly to the local soldiers, and were able to raise a substantial size army. So behind any warfare, obviously the bankers and the people who control the purse had a huge influence, which is quite obvious. And now at the same time, some of the people who are suffering were the natives, and because by this time, as Indian subcontinent is heavily dependent upon monsoon, and with some poor harvest, and with the new tax laws, which were quite rigid, and with the emphasis that occurs on growing cash crops instead of regular food, cash crops such as indigo and later opium and cotton. Obviously, they could raise the cotton, but the prices were set by the middlemen and the money lenders. And so the farmers found themselves always in a debt and being tried to their land, and the debt burden kept increasing. And so that was there with each successive generation. Their families enlarged, the land size decreased, and they became more and more poor as decades passed. And at the same time, company was very interested in raising revenues for increasingly expanding military expenses, not just in India, but by that time they were venturing in Southeast Asia and other places as well. Okay, and due to copyrights, I cannot show the video, but Jeremy Paxman, who was one of the British BBC announcers, he toured and made a documentary. And the talk was, he's talking to a lieutenant in the Madras Regiment in the modern India, and looking at the bulletin board of the company headquarters, he's amazed that the Madras battalion or company fought all over the world, not in Burma, Hong Kong, Malaya, Ethiopia, Baghdad, and Mesopotamia. So this was amazing how the soldiers for hire were farmed out to the expanding and never-ending wars conducted by the British Empire over the next almost couple of hundred years. And obviously they benefited from the non-political discipline of the Indian Army. Now we'll dwell more into the character who was a big role player in South India, and as I mentioned about, he was a Muslim by religion, and was a fairly successful ruler, and he inherited his father's kingdom and expanded it a little bit by fighting with the Nizam from north and the Marathas. But at the same time, he had enough foresight to train his own soldiers with French mercenaries. Because as you can see, after the end of the French War, a lot of the French soldiers were left without employment, and they were offering their expertise to anybody who was willing to hire them, including this Tipu Sultan and the Mysore and Bangalore kingdom, and even in the central area, the ruler who was immensely rich called Nizam, and his capital was the present-day city of Hyderabad. Okay, now obviously the trade was the big revenue market for him, and the Mysore silk was known worldwide. And at the same time, he had imported enough technologies from Central Asia, which involved, which was again transmitted by the Chinese and into rocketry. So this rocketry has figures large in the American War. And some of these rockets that Tipu Sultan used against the British Army or the East India Company Army was copied and reverse engineered during the by the British Army in the War of 1812. And you remember the famous American anthem, "Rockets Flare, Our Flag" was still there. So these rockets were reverse engineered. Initially, the rockets were made of paper and cardboard. Okay, but the Brits improved it with steel and iron, and those were the rockets that were used during the war in Baltimore Harbor, and was immortalized in the tribute that Francis Scott Key wrote in the American national anthem. Okay, so but we're digressing, and it was possible. Now, interestingly, this were political entities, and even though Tipu Sultan was Muslim, he was not above praying to Hindu gods, and at the same time, they were endowing the mosques as well as Sufi shrines and temples. Okay, so a lot of it was they were in principle they were Muslims, but they were not fanatic as the case has been in last 50 or so years. But with the rise of the Saudi kingdom, and at the same time, the Marathas, who were Hindu by religion, it was not about them to destroy the other kings' temples and state idols or deities of the enemies when they invaded the neighboring land. So, as it happens during war, they not only captured the land and revenue and gold and silver, but at the same time, just to humiliate and humble the enemy and to remove the source of his power, they destroyed their places of worship as well. And so this was, and at the same time, religion did play some role that when during one of the many so-called Mysore wars that took place, several Brits were captured by the Muslim Sultan, and they were forcibly circumcised and given Muslim names, and were told to change their faith. So the religion support as well as fanaticism worked on both ways. Okay, so that's the interesting part of the history that is muddled and complicated, to say the least. Okay, and this is one of the most popular exhibits at the British Museum. Tipu Sultan, during the first couple of wars, he gave the East India Company a rough time because his army was well militarily trained by the French mercenaries, and he had obviously enough wealth to support and a larger army. So in the First and Second War, the Tipu Sultan defeated and gave a bloody lip to the East India Company army, and because obviously the resources were relatively limited compared to a big empire with larger resources. So just to celebrate his victory, he had commissioned a toy. As you can see, this is Tipu. He nicknamed himself Tipu the Tiger. Okay, and this dog was a mechanically genius toy. Remember, this is before electricity, but you can see a tiger, attacking an Englishman who is helpless, and you can hear the cries of the Englishman and the roar of the tiger. So it was a mechanical genius, obviously, by that time, engineering and levers and the clock technology was quite advanced in Europe. So this was the toy that he had commissioned, and eventually, when he lost in the third or the final war of the Mysore War, this toy was sequestered by Britain, and ended up in the British Museum. Okay, so that's we are digressing. So this was discovered in his summer palace, in 1799, and so this was to be an exhibit in the Tower of London, and was exhibited and eventually ended up in the Victorian Museum. Okay, and from that it's still in this station. I'm sorry, I misspoke. It was not in the British Museum, but it's in the V&A Museum, Victoria and Albert Museum. And again, he was named to be reckoned with, that even in Britain at that time, his name was well recognized by the ordinary shopkeepers. And you could just see that how it was marketed, Indian curry powder. So business went hand in glove along with the trade. And, so some enterprising merchant, marketed, Indian curry powder with, the name recognition that was obviously common knowledge amongst the local Brits. And so, and he had bigger ideas than that have come to be known. Because he had established, contact with the Turks, with the Egyptian rulers, and as well as the Persian rulers, with the idea of establishing a ring of Muslim empires extending all the way from Egypt to Middle East, and to extending into India. So he was an ambitious person, to say the least. And then again, at the same time, on one hand, he would support the temples and mosques, but at the same time, he could be very savage and ruthless, as we saw in the example of forcefully circumcising the enemy soldiers, and taking revenge to the defeated opposition. Okay, and now moving on to the other side, to the Bay of Bengal, with the love of exploration and botanical adventure that was in vogue by the British explorer around the world. They were looking for valuable and marketable botanical products, and the enthusiasm in botany and the scholarliness was prevalent in not only in scholars and naturalists or scientists, but was also infected a lot of the empire builders. And a gentleman named Colonel Robert Kidd, he founded the earliest Calcutta Botanical Garden, because the tropical flora and fauna was quite different than what they had seen in the homeland. And then there was also, this was not done just for science, but there was commercial interest, which involved tea, various types of wood, spices, and tea. And again, the wood was useful for shipbuilding. And at the same time, the Indian businessmen were very quick to monetize and join into the thing. For example, the ship that was used, HMS Minton, I think that's the name, in 1812, was engineered in the naval yards of an Indian merchant, Zoroastrian Parsi named Vaidya. So, because by that time the Indian wood was a lot more sturdier, bigger, and that was quite handy for ship manufacturing. So, as early as early 1800, shipbuilding yards came into existence in Bombay, and I'm sure to some extent in Calcutta as well. So the locals were very instrumental in collaborating and taking advantage of the worldwide business opportunities. They were always a second-class citizen, and they had to work along with the British traders. But obviously, the profits trickled down, and the economics penetrated to the enterprising business people who adopted English language and the British way of doing business worldwide, and including later on into more shady trades of opium trade. But that's another story. once did a talk on the drug trade, which involved Indian merchants, British, and this primarily Scottish traders, and forced opium onto China, leading to the First and Second Opium War. But that's that's not part of our talk at the time. So I will just mention that in passing. Okay, so this was we were talking about the botanical garden. Okay, so now he had some illustrious contacts with none other than Joseph Banks, who was the founder of the Kew Gardens in London and was the president for several years of the Royal Society, which was the intellectual body which supported scientific explorations in multiple disciplines, including astronomy, horticulture, botany, and so on, and fundamental experiments in chemistry, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, they had studied the famous Indian banyan tree, and at the same time, with various. This was before photography, so they had varieties of illustrations of the Indian flora and fauna, and this the tradition continued, and this garden is still very much there. And obviously, the cash crops that emerged from that were sugarcane, indigo, and so the botanical knowledge was transferred and studied and in very scientific basis. Okay, and you can see the great Indian banyan tree, and it is still very much there, one of the greatest attractions of the botanical gardens. Okay, and it's, I know, as trees get to be, it's 250 years old and has multiple branches. Okay, and you can see that it's still very much nourishing and maybe around if after you and I are gone. Okay, and now the recruitment that I mentioned about the Madras Regiment, that was one of the first native regiments that was raised. And by this time, there were a lot of racial attitudes were permeating through the East India Company, and especially the officer character and white versus black, and the part of the American racist attitude, the slave trade was infiltrating and being practiced at great length in the subcontinent as well. So the camaraderie that took place between the Mughal princes and princesses in the earlier days, when the East India Company officers were on the receiving end, once they gathered power, the arrogance and the racist attitude came to the surface. And by this time, they had learned to see, because as we mentioned, India is a subcontinent, and since there are huge physical, cultural, and social differences between a Swede and an Italian, where there are substantial differences between a North Indian and a South Indian, based on speech, clothing, diet, dialect, and also the ability to get involved in war, and that can be stereotyped, and with the so-called idea that some people are naturally gifted, and the so-called pseudoscience, the East India Company indulged in classifying as to who were the quote-unquote martial races, which obviously they classified the Punjabis, the Sikhs, the Gurkhas, and Muslims as became the empires of the sepoys. On the other hand, the intellectual and scholarly Bengalis became the clerks and the administrators of the British Empire. And this was again, now by this time, as I have mentioned many times, the loyalty based on the Hindu culture was to the one who was provided the salt or paid the salary, because because the communication was far and apart, so people in the south had no concept, and people so somebody who's in the northeast corner were totally alien to them, and especially if they had a different religion, if they were not Hindus, and they considered Muslims as alien culture, and they particularly did not care as to who paid their salary. And at the same time, the the sheer numbers of white soldiers was relatively small, that led to resorting of the East India Company to hiring the natives and training them to fight for salary and in the European manner. Now, at the same time, even in the East India Company Army, there were two distinct class distinctions that took place. That the people who were in the King's Army, or the Queen's Army, as the case may have been at the time, were considered superior, more elite, and better trained, and they looked down upon the Indian Army, even though they could be white and as well trained, but they were considered second class, and the commission that was secured in the King's Army. Now, at that time, a lot of the rich and upper class gentry actually purchased their commission. And so it wasn't always the training, but your accident of birth had a lot to do with as to whether you're going to be a colonel or lieutenant. And the class structure in even amongst white permeated, because obviously the administrators and the civil service people were on the top, the military people were right underneath them, and were more or less of equal range. Then came the traders, and who were the owned the tea estates and businessmen who had established companies. And below them were what came to be known as boxwallas, who were the sort of small-time British traders who tried to eke out a living, working with the natives. So it was a big hierarchy and a class structure that was prevalent in at the home, was duplicated in the subcontinent as well. Okay, so that's an interesting cultural norm meme that was carried out. And as you can see, the fight, this is just a depiction of as to who had the long bayonets and rifles, loading rifles, as to the other side that fought with swords and arrows. Okay, so obviously the mismatch was quite apparent. Okay, as to who had more discipline and fired in a systematic, regimental way, as opposed to a chaotic attack as that took place. So no wonder they were successful. Now, this was an interesting character who is well known to literary people of literary background. William, interesting name, Makepeace Thackeray, and his father, he was a famous author whose works are still read and studied. Okay, and his father worked for East India Company, and he was born in Calcutta. And again, his life was well dramatized, and some of his work have made into movies. And again, obviously, at that time they were raised by ayahs and the Indian nannies. Okay, and this sometimes, and they're sometimes they married the native women, and these liaisons were common amongst the gentlemen of East India Company. And so this was, the initial intersex relationships were quite common amongst the white and probably the upper class Indian establishment of both religion. Okay, and that created the whole community, which later came to be known as Anglo-Indians, and that changed after the 1857, when quite segregation took hold, because by the time steam and women, it was easier for women to travel, and they put their foot down and stopped the sexual peccadillos that took place. Another governor who is a brother is better known, Richard Wellesley. Okay, and his brother was the famous Arthur Wellesley, better known as Duke of Wellington. Okay, and Richard Wellesley was a powerful figure, an administrator, and military man in his own right. He worked only for 7 years in the Indian subcontinent, again as Governor General of Calcutta. By this time, Calcutta was the capital of British India, and Delhi was a spent of force, and the Mughal emperor ruled just in name from Delhi. Obviously, he did not control much of the authority, and actually paid tribute and granted permit on paper to whosoever threatened him, and was now Wellesley expanded the empire with more and more military adventures, and at the same time he recruited the local king rajas or princes and nawabs in subsidiary alliance, that they were allowed to keep their kingdom or estate in their manner as long as they paid tribute and listened to the resident who was appointed as an advisor, and to keep an eye on it so that they would not challenge the authority and suzerainty of the British burgeoning and newly expanding British Empire. And again, so they were, and obviously the British authorities played blind eye as to whether they were good rulers or bad rulers. And out of the several hundred of them which became part of it and became known as the Maharajas for their prolific and wasteful lifestyle, and it's a chapter on itself. There were a few good rulers, which we'll talk about as we go on, but majority of them were despotic and were indulged in self-indulgence and wasting the revenue of their state. And they varied from anywhere from a small area of few villages to kingdom, primarily I mentioned earlier, called Nizam of South India, which kingdom was very wealthy and equivalent to that of modern day France. So, in some of them adopted British ways and became more Anglophile, and that's another chapter, but I don't want to digress too much. And then by this time, Wellesley had also instituted several reforms. And by this time, what Cornwallis had started by defeating Tipu Sultan in South, Wellesley finally concluded then and literally absorbed the Mysore kingdom and appointed, instead of the Muslim Tipu's dynasty, whose sons were taken as hostage by Lord Cornwallis. And I have a picture somewhere coming up, I think, or I may have missed it, sorry. And he established a Hindu Maharaja on the Mysore dynasty, and they stayed in the power until the Indian independence. And on the other side, in Calcutta, he had established a college, Fort Williams College, to train the more upper class natives, as well as some of the prince's sons, into the British ways and Western science. And at the same time, and just for good measures, he had collected various artworks, which was called company style painting from the Mughal era. And at the same time, he was always, constant wars were going on in South India. He was involved in was what came to be known as Mappila warfare. This is way down in south in what is present-day Kerala, and this was predominantly Muslim area, and and by this time they were more fanatically religious, and they continued the fighting even though they were outgunned and outnumbered. And finally, the rebellion of these wars was put down, and by the overwhelming strength of the British Indian Army. And they took a revenge by burning down the crops and villages. Now, at the same time, Napoleon was in his heydays, and there was always this constant fear of Napoleon marching through Egypt, and so this was again no sort of opposition or involvement with French was permitted, and by this time they had ventured into the foothills of Himalayas of the Kingdom of Nepal and managed to make Nepal subsidiary kingdom, and this led to large unemployment amongst the locals, who came to be known as Gurkhas, and they proved to be fantastic soldiers. And even until modern day, the British Army has a battalion of Gurkhas who served loyally in Hong Kong and in the British Army. Okay, and so this was, and now obviously the empire expanded by leaps and bounds under Wellesley and others who followed him. But this was quite an expensive venture to the extent of 28 million pounds, which is translated to about 20 times more and in present money. But and at the same time, the communication lines were expanded, so the company headquarters had very little control over what the local governor general did, because it was the communication or their reprimand was after the fact most of the times. Now, at the same time, England was a Protestant, and evangelical zeal had followed on the tails of the empire, and this was considered as a mission to civilize the dark people who were idol worshippers, and the only true religion was Christianity. So this was after 1813. A lot of the ministers went to India to promote Christianity, and at the same time, they rightly saw some of the Indian practices, which were very inhuman, such as killing the female child birth, and at the same time there was Indian culture that few very devout women would burn themselves on a burning pyre, and when their husband died, it was called sati, and this practice was in practice in at least in a small to moderate way, and obviously and with the cooperation of the Indian reformers, this was banned and was finally outlawed. Okay, and now by this time, as I mentioned earlier, briefly, that the interest in native languages, primarily for the interest to do business and to understand the local languages, was in full force, and the scholars who were well educated in Latin and Greek traveled and saw the connection between Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit, and obviously by this time the concept of origin of Europe and the so-called Aryan theory was in vogue, and this gave them at least a moral or psychological justification for empire, that the Indians were our long lost brothers who had migrated from in the Caucasus, and obviously they had lost their religious ways, and it was the duty of the enlightened Brits to reform this people. And so, as we mentioned earlier, Orientalist school was quite popular and scholarly, and they did varieties of scholarly works, and some of that work still continues. As you can see, the recent publication, Aryans and British India, and the Oriental Society was established right after the Bengal Empire in Calcutta, and obviously this was an all-white affair, and the locals were, even though they were studying local cultures, it took several years before the locals were invited to join. Okay, and obviously they were looking down upon the native Indians as barbaric, effeminate, and this was in the idea of racial superiority were well entrenched by this time. Okay, and this was a unique group for a very small period of time in the 18th century, who followed the idea of being rationalist, classic, and cosmopolitan. And so they did appreciate the ancient Indian culture and translated several works meticulously in various languages, including English and German. So and the one that comes to mind is William Jones, who was called the Oriental Jones. He was a philologist par excellence, and he was appointed as a judge of Supreme Court in Calcutta. And he was the founder of what later and still is the Asiatic Society in 1864. And he was the instrumental in seeing the link between Indo-European languages. And he was prolific in linguist, and not only knew most of the European languages, but was well versed in Persian, Arabic, and was able to see the link. You can see he knew 13 languages and others partial. So, and he saw became the prime philologist, and saw the Sanskrit language, whatever be it antiquity, is a wonderful structure, and he saw the link between grammar, and he praised Sanskrit as being more perfect than Greek, more copious than Latin, and exquisitely refined. And so he was amazed with the grammar depth, and that was in Sanskrit. And then again, he saw there's some similarity between Gothic and Celtic languages through different idioms, and so was able to see the link of what has now come to be known as Indo-Iranian group of languages. So the linguistic tree in science of philology was getting extensive scholarly treatment. Okay, now at the same time, another Orientalist named Colin Mackenzie, okay, he became the Surveyor General of India because they had huge interest in land, primarily to increase revenue. He was a Scotsman, well versed in mathematics and surveyor, and was able to study local languages, and became the Surveyor General of India, and later on in Java, and completed the first systematic survey of land reform survey. Okay, and so this was, several people who did very scholarly work in different disciplines in the subcontinent. Okay, I think hopefully that I'll be able to play this without incurring copyright. And this is about the cotton market and the importance of trade, which was the prima facie purpose.
By the early 18th century, worried by the popularity of Indian textiles, wool and silk makers in England began protesting against the import of Indian cotton textiles. In 1720, the British government enacted a legislation banning the use of printed cotton textiles, chintz, in England. Interestingly, this act was known as the Calico Act. At this time, textile industries had just begun to develop in England. Unable to compete with Indian textiles, English producers wanted a secure market within the country by preventing the entry of Indian textiles. The first to grow under government protection was the calico printing industry. Indian designs were now imitated and printed in England on white muslin or plain unbleached Indian cloth. In 1764, the spinning jenny was invented by John Kay, which increased the productivity of the traditional spindles. The invention of the steam engine by Richard Arkwright in 1786 revolutionized cotton textile weaving. Indian textiles continued to dominate world trade till the end of the 18th century. European trading companies, the Dutch, the French, and the English made enormous profits out of this flourishing trade. These companies purchased cotton and silk textiles in India by importing silver. when the English East India Company gained political power in Bengal, it no longer had to import precious metal to buy Indian goods. Instead, they collected revenues from peasants and zamindars in India and used this revenue to buy Indian textiles.
Okay, so that we already had summarized earlier, but this was nicely summarized in. So chintz was originally a woodblock printed, and stained calico was produced in India from 1600 onwards. Became very popular in Europe for bed covers, quilts, draperies, and and obviously the French declared a ban on it as early as 1686. And in 1720, as she mentioned, the British Parliament enacted a law banning this use. The company purchased plain white material and financed the rising industrial revolution. And obviously the various dye techniques were imported, and by this time the rise of chemical industry in Germany again changed the balance of trade dramatically. Okay, and this was an interesting book as a woman who had traveled and lived in India and became one of the early travel writers. She spoke positively about the land and the cuisine. Not surprising considering the English cooking at that time. The Wandering of a Pilgrim, and she also wrote the book about Begums, which is the wife of the Muslim gentry or upper class thugs, okay, who were, the no good robbers of travelers on the road, and the white Mughals are the people who married, that the local Muslim women primarily. And so this was the journal of Fanny Parks, The Wandering of Pilgrims in Search of Picturesque, during 24 years in the East. She lived in Calcutta and then moved to a city called Allahabad, which is the junction of two big rivers, because following her husband. And she wrote travel bags, and she learned a lot of native languages, and her memoirs were well received. And she also saw the practice of sati, and because and obviously property had a lot to do with it, because obviously the estate, which was the land, was valuable, and she also admired the architecture and beauty of the Taj Mahal. Okay. Interestingly, on the other side, there were reforms that were carried out. It was the rise of the religious movement called utilitarianism, and the founder of that was Jeremy Bentham, and his wish was that his body should be preserved, and his wishes were honored, and his body was mummified, and his body was preserved, dressed in his traditional style, and still preserved at the University College of London, and is brought out annually at the meeting. Okay, as you can see, his rather ghoulish looking preservation body that is preserved, and the principle was quite noble, and it was practiced only in small colonies, and he left America, and he left England and established in America, I think, to the best of my recollection. And the big principle is quite noble, greatest good for the greatest number of people, and insisted on individual rights, separation of church. It was against slavery and death penalty. And his student became even more famous than himself, named John Stuart Mill of India, a well-known historian. And he wrote, just sitting in London, the history of India based on papers and research. And he advocated the enlightenment for Indians. He contended that having reached a certain stage, they don't seem to have made further progress. So it was this was like an intellectual justification for the empire. So in other words, he believed it was beneficial for Indians to be ruled by benevolently by the British. Okay, and at the same time. So this was an intellectual exercise, and this book was widely read by who's who of the administrators in the military upper class who were traveling to India. So the book had a vast reaching influence for several decades. And now this is an interesting map which would be worthwhile showing if and the spread of colonialism. And you can see it starts with 1600 and some, oh, sorry. You see the time meter making way. We have Portuguese, orange is Netherlands, red is English, the other colors now then the blue is French. Hopefully you can see the colors. Primarily in the coastal areas, as we mentioned earlier. And you see the change in the French and huge influence, English in Bengal and in the coastal areas. The Danes disappeared primarily. Portuguese maintained a few colonies. So Burma, Nepal, Afghanistan comes and goes from time to time. Red influence here. And the other areas that you see which are less red are the local princes and Rajput kings who were left to their own devices, but under the thumb of the British authorities. Okay, I will see that Wikipedia material independence. Okay, I'm sorry, I missed a slide here. Okay, and there were company style paintings. There was some work done in artwork as well. So subjects included portraits, landscapes, the scenes of the Indian people, their festivals, various castes. As you can see, these were well recorded by varieties of artists and patroned by a lot of the military men. And the one that will loom larger during the mutiny of 1857 was James Skinner, okay, and who was married to a local woman and encouraged various artworks. Okay, and again, I mentioned earlier the Marquis of Wellesley. He was a brother of Duke of Wellington, who had collected 2,500 paintings. Okay, and the French and Portuguese had their share of collections, and varieties of Muslim artists and Hindu artist works were commissioned and supported. Okay, so there was a whole school of company style artwork that came into popularity. And again, there were the coins were printed. You can see the British lion, and the local languages were supported, primarily Persian or Urdu, as it came to be known. Okay. Now, at the same time, there were young officers who had absolutely no inclination of how to deal with the locals, and various books were written called Griffins in India, and it has nothing to do with Harry Potter, or perhaps may have, Gryffindor. The young officers were called, and varieties of spoof books were written in the 19th century by art writer named Tom Raw, and this was, that glorified the tent life, and they had huge number of servants. In fact, one officer would have as many as 12 or 15 people waiting upon him, starting from one person who brushes his shoes to another garden, or somebody who washes his clothes, and so on and so forth. And so this was a different lifestyle, and it was hard for them to maintain because it was even with huge numbers, it was expensive to maintain lifestyle. So they were always in debt. And obviously the keeping up appearance had a huge role to play as well. And no wonder that corruption was rampant and making money on the side and becoming rich. And this was, we already talked about the racial buildup of the army that took place. Various regiments where the martial races were encouraged and kept intentionally separate. Okay, and we talked about Richard Wellesley earlier. Okay, and I think this slide was that a duplicate that should have eliminated. We already went over this. Interestingly, and by this time their fears were coming up of the expanding Russian Empire, because the Tsar's empire was expanding by leaps and bounds through Central and Eastern Asia, and the fears were infiltrating among the Brits that they may threaten their Indian possessions, and therefore the various Muslim kingdoms, including Afghanistan and the province called Sindh, which is in modern-day Pakistan, were attacked by finding some type of a cause for either poor governance or local discontent. And so a manufactured excuse were used to attack by the Indian Army and their camp followers. And a well-known soldier named was an older person named Charles Napier, no connection with the inventor of the logarithm, who was a different Napier. And he managed to take a huge army and was able to outgun and put down the Sindh empire. And he is quoted with this famous telegram. By this time, telegram was available as to sending a telegram with Pakawi, which translated in from Latin is called "I have sinned." So that one can see this is a pun on sinned, S-I-N-N-E-D, to S-I-N-D-H. Now, whether he actually said that or not, that is a matter of conjecture. Maybe the secretary, who was better educated than him, was probably contributory in sending this telegram. And so the rebellion that was occurred in Sindh, was brutally put down. And he again, became transferred and fought in the European theater against Napoleon. Okay. Okay, so this was again, Pakawi, I have sinned, so this is the quote from that. I already described that to you, so I won't dwell too much on it. And again, so then we talked about the John Stuart Mill's History of India. And as you can see that he wrote the history sitting comfortably in London, Okay, and this was his published work. And okay, and the famous philosopher was his son. He worked for East India Company, and he again his thought, as I liberated earlier, that these countries such as India and China were once progressive, but now were stagnant and barbarous, and justifying the rule. Okay, and especially when the Crown took over direct control in 1857. So he was defending the company rule by writing pamphlets of memorandums on improvement of the administration. Okay, and again, so he was given a seat on the Council of India. Okay, and so again, his influence, intellectual influence, was substantial, as I mentioned a little while ago. And there were others, who were instrumental in discovering Royal Botanical Garden, and the natural history was incorporated in the tea plant. There was the start of the tea industry in India, importing from China, because the weather was very similar and they did not have to pay cash, which they had to the Chinese. So local growth that was under there. And that led to the tea estates and the whole new class of rich Britishers who bought off land and employed the local people to work in the tea gardens. Okay, and tea plants were growing in Assam, and so this way they were able to reduce the import of tea from China. Okay. And so it's a little controversy who actually was the original discoverer, but he's the one who gets the nod, generally speaking. Okay. Now, at the same time, I mentioned that on the tails of the British merchants, local Parsis or Zoroastrians, who arrived, who were very quick to learn English and follow the Brits' footsteps into trade. And the one that needs to be mentioned was Sir Jamshedji Jejeebhoy, okay, who was born in 1873 and was a Parsi merchant in Bombay, and was heavily involved in opium trade along with the other Scottish businessmen who established the export of India from two types of opium from Bombay and central India, and the other type was from Calcutta, which was grown in the foothills of Himalayas in Bihar. Okay, so these were forced upon the Chinese, and obviously the trade was during the French and English wars. Jejeebhoy was captured by a French naval ship and spent some time, but was eventually, with the end of war, was released and went on to be a very successful and rich businessman. And his descendants have done a lot of charity work in Bombay, and one can still see the JJ Hospital in Bombay. And on the other side, the local Bengalis were, again, very quick to join the trade and Western education. And the one that needs to be mentioned is a person named Dwarkanath Tagore. And now he was a already wealthy landowner in Bengal and what is present-day Bangladesh. And he was participated in banking and mining, as well as acquiring a lot of land. And obviously, as it quite happens, when you become wealth, you are recognized by the administrator or rulers. And he traveled to London and was considered, well, he's almost an Hindu gentleman, and met the who is who grandees in London. And similarly, and by this time, the company had established various titles, including granting the title of Sir, and the local equivalent titles were established. Okay, and to facilitate their ego and rewarding the loyalty that went along with business. Okay, all right, Chief. And another person who was equally involved was an Iraqi Jew who worked in Baghdad and obviously went out of favor with the Ottoman sultans and rulers, and was able to hide some of his gold and travel to the newly established British colony of Bombay, and made his fortune initially in textile and later on opium trade. And he, again, as it happened, the globalization was very much in vogue even at that time with the American Civil War. He benefited hugely from the Civil War. And again, he gradually had several sons, and they were stationed in Baghdad, Bombay, Calcutta, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. So they had intricate family network, and was able to undercut the Scottish businessmen and became immensely wealthy. And later on saw that the bigger fortunes were to be made in Hong Kong and Shanghai. So he moved all of his empire. But still, some of his charities are still very much apparent in Bombay, evidenced by what is known as Sassoon Dock and Sassoon Hospital, which are still very much in existence. Okay, so then now again, at the same time, there were some other Orientalists who deserve to be mentioned. One that deserves to mention is a person named James Prinsep. Okay, he was again an English scholar, Orientalist, and they studied antiques, founding journal of the Journal of Asiatic Society, and deciphered various languages, and because earlier, as I mentioned, William Jones had died at a relatively young age, before his 40s, due to infectious disease, possibly cholera or something else, or malaria. Okay, so Prinsep continued his work and deciphered various scripts and various coins, and saw the connectivity between during the time of Alexander, of the Indo-Greek culture and the cultural amalgamation that took place in present-day Afghanistan and further north, what was known as Bactria. Okay, and he was involved in metallurgy and other sciences, and was head of the mint, so it was in the right place. And at the same time, a Scottish businessman named David Hume established what came to be known as Hare School and Hindu School, where he educated the natives and formed varieties of mixed society, and was rightly so very popular amongst the locals. And another reformer who was even better known is Lord William Bentinck, who was a man of power. He was the Governor General before the mutiny for almost 8 years, 7 or 8 years. He did the various court reforms. He introduced English, and that led to the natural decline of Persian. That was the lingua franca of the Mughal Empire. And he saw the bad practices that had infiltrated and had become more widespread in the Hindu religion, called sati, means burning women on a pyre at the time of the death of her husband. And he worked with various Indian reformers, and obviously was able to legalize and banning the practice. And he, at the same time, reformed the court system. Okay, and that gave the Indians a head start by learning the British bureaucracy and English language. And so the regulations were passed as early as 1829, and with the help of another reformer, which we'll get to in just a few minutes. Okay, and social reformers, and but the local reformers had a huge role to play at the same time. Okay. And this is the reformer who worked with Lord Bentinck. He was a Hindu reformist. He was a Pandit, means a scholar, and a Munshi means a scribe. And he established a non-caste reform group movement called Brahmo Samaj, and where all people are equal. And he also studied some of the Western religious works, and was involved in religious and social reform. And he was again very fluent, well-versed in Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, English, and Greek. And he was probably one of the first scholar to travel to England. And here is as they're quite often in London, there are various blue plaques where people have died. And he died in London, and he was invited to be a member of the Parliament. Okay, and you can see where he lived here, he's memorialized, and his statue is there somewhere in London area. And on the west coast, there was another governor of Bombay province, who was in charge for almost 28 years, and he established the Bombay University. He again, in competing with Mills, wrote the history of India, and established former Western education on the west coast of India. And this is his bust at St. Paul's Cathedral. And he also ventured, to prevent Napoleon from venturing to Afghanistan. And one of the a well-regarded college in Bombay is still called Elphinstone College in his memory. And another person who deserves to be mentioned is Sir Alexander Cunningham, who was a British Army engineer who worked with the Bengal Engineer Group, took interest in history and archaeology of India, it led to his appointment of Archaeological Survey of India, and became, wrote numerous books and monographs, and his collections and the coins and the Buddhist sculptures and everything else was bought by the British Museum in 19th century. And this is his painting of the Leh Palace in Tibet. As you can see that he has had varieties of interest and went to a long way of preserving the records of the religious culture in faraway lands. Okay, and now I can't show this movie, but The White Mughals, this is a work by a British historian researcher who combines his work from India and Britain, called William Dalrymple, and has written varieties of works. And his first work was White Mughals, about the lifestyle of the Brits who married the local women and had some divided loyalties. This was actually, the book can be considered as a work of social history about the good relationship in either in political, cultural, and carnal that were prevalent in the British and Indians in the 18th and 19th century. Okay, and it was quoted that 1 in 3 British men married to an Indian woman at that time. And in fact, one of them was named somewhat derogatively as Charles Hindu Stewart. And there were some, obviously, not everybody was that acceptant. And there was wide opposition, was looking down upon people who socialized with the natives. Some of them actually went on and converted to Islam and married local women and became a subject of divided loyalties. And that was dramatized in the movie and books called White Mughal. And on the other side, the people who were reformers, to improve irrigation, various canals were built by an engineer named Arthur Cotton, who is an evangelist, and he did a lot of useful work, and he still relieved the famine in the east coast of India, in the region between Calcutta and Madras, the coastal region, which will depend upon the rivers and the wills and whims of the monsoon. So varieties of aqueduct were drawn, and this was his doing, was to build canals to provide around the year irrigation. And again, he pleaded to the parliament to make sure that the revenues were actually, adjusted to make allowance for the famine. So he's still very popular, and he's celebrated with his statue in the east coast of India. And these are the famous canals that were built in the northern part as well, and the various canals that were there from Mughal era, which were running into disrepair, were improved, and a vast area was brought under cultivation, leading to one of the largest canals were built for that time. And this was bigger than the canals that were there in Europe and Egypt, and even compared to the Pennsylvania Canal, it was bigger. Okay, so there was some good engineering work that was done primarily to increase revenue and local grain production. And this was, I mentioned earlier about the Hindu college that was started, and it was divided into 2 sections. One was imparted in English, other was in native languages. Okay, so, and the Western science was quickly introduced and adopted with astronomy, mathematics, chemistry. And so that led to what came to be known as a renaissance of Bengali culture. And that took off and has still dominated the Indian educational and cultural scene until the present day. Okay, and we already talked about him. I'm sorry, I didn't eliminate my slide. Okay, and that's in the way. Now, the one person who actually changed dramatically this thing was administrator of Louisville called Thomas Macaulay, and he was quite instrumental in replacing Persian with English, and formalized what came to be known as Indian Penal Code. But at the same time, he was quite racist, to put it mildly, that he insisted that from 6th year onward, the schooling should be in European learning with English as medium of instruction. And his purpose was to create a class of Anglicized Indians who would work as cultural intermediaries between Brits and India, and was necessary for reform. And because we did not, he realized rightly that there wasn't enough manpower, so needed a class that was English in taste but Indian in appearance. And so this was, so he wanted to create a whole new cadre, and which he more or less to some extent succeeded. But at the same time, he quite looked down upon, as apparent from his statement. I've never found one amongst who could deny that a single shelf of good European library was worth more than the whole native literature of India and Arabia for good measures. So again, the racist attitudes were quite pervasive, at least among some, and if not quite the majority of them. And again, and again, that by this time, the different sexual mores was quite a shock to the Puritan Victorian society. So, with some of the architecture and artwork that were discovered as to the polygamy and passions that were around, so and that were quite shocking, but at the same time were enjoyed by the Brits. And Indian prostitutes were more like courtesans, unlike London, and some of the erotic paintings in temples were shocking, but at the same time were exciting to the inhibited the West Europe English culture. And at the same time, homosexuality was accepted, and those who were hiding their preferences, had almost a free reign. Okay, and now another little side venture that before we stop for this session would be the rise of the Sikh Empire. The Sikhs was a religion that rose on as an amalgamation between Muslims and Hindu. They rejected the Hindu caste system, and at the same time they rejected the fanaticism of Islam, and they took some elements of both cultures and tried to carve out their own rule in a small area in Punjab, which is the bordering Afghanistan and India. And gradually, with the weakening of the Mughal Empire, they gradually expanded their reign and managed for a while to control the entire Afghanistan and later on part of Kashmir. And again, they were good fighters and well organized, employed French and various wandering European mercenaries in training, and had a substantial army to reckon with. And obviously, this was considered as a threat, because the fears of the Russian Empire were always existent. And again, when and we'll see how there were several wars that were carried out with the Sikh Empire by the East India Company at that time, and quite of them, ferocious fighting came, and the East India Company actually for the first time lost battles, and the Sikhs managed to give them a bloody lip, okay, and came out on top. And so Sikhism was founded, as I said, in 1550. And they suffered at great length with the Mughal establishment. Various of their preachers or gurus that were killed by Muslim emperors, and their axiom or their principle was 5 Ks. There's keeping long hair, wearing a bracelet, carrying a small dagger, and a cotton underwear. So this was their thing, and they actually fed anybody who came to their temple free. Well, I may have a slide coming up for that afterwards. Okay. And at the same time, there were varieties of fun studies, of fun books that were published. A character named Fleshman in Tom Brown's School Days, and about the various stories where some tall tales were, incorporated about the adventures in the empire. Tom Brown's School Days and series of books were written just to give you what was going on in the cultural traditions of British literary establishment. Okay, and this is, we talked about when the Sikh Empire was finally taken over and defeated, then the Diamond Kohinoor which had traveled a long journey from 13th century mines in South India to the Mughal kings, to Persia and to Afghanistan, and ended up in the Sikh kingdom. And when this Sikh king Ranjit Singh had died without heir, and his son was almost 10 years old and was under the guardianship of his mother. So after his defeat, he was encouraged to, first of all, he was taken under the trusteeship of a British clergyman and was sent to London for education. But at the same time, he was encouraged to give a gift of this precious diamond to Her Majesty Queen Victoria. And so this was the large 790 carat diamond that was given to Queen Victoria and was cut and polished. And so this is an interesting tale. And the heir of Ranjit Singh, the last king of Sikh Empire, lived in Britain all his life. And was quite wealthy with his estate, and gave fabulous parties. But at the same time, he was very reluctantly accepted or tolerated in the British upper class society. Okay, so now we'll continue with the dictation. Okay, and so this diamond has a very colorful story, and the diamond is called Kohinoor, and it is still in the royal crown jewels, as you can see from Queen Elizabeth, wearing it in the crown, and it's in the Tower of London. Okay, so an interesting story for those who are interested. Okay. And this was the king of Lion of Punjab. It is the river of area of 5 rivers. Okay, and he was Ranjit Singh. He was blind in one eye, and was poorly educated, but was a master organizer of united various Sikh confederacies, and he fought the Afghans and instituted several reforms and renovated the famous Golden Temple from Amritsar. And again, polygamy was quite common, and unfortunately, his subsequent generations were a lot of infighting, and this was just for amusement, that lion and lion's cub. So Dalip Singh was turned out to be not. And here is the famous Dalip Singh, who still in the regal style of his father Ranjit Singh, and again, and he had many wives, and his daughter became part of one of the suffragettes named, in early Britain when the women's lib and the voting rights. You can see how, and since she was a princess, she was not arrested or harassed as a lot of the other suffragettes were. Okay, so again, being of a semi-royal ancestry worked out to her advantage. Okay, and so some after a really costly battle, the Sikh Empire was absorbed in and the Sikhs changed loyalty, and they became one of the very most loyal soldiers in the British Army, and British Indian Army, so to speak. Okay, and again, at the same time, there were a scattering of mercenaries that sought their fortune. One, Jean-Francois Allard, who was obviously a Frenchman. He fought in Waterloo, Persia, and then made his way to Punjab, fought for the Sikhs. Another was an American, who was a mercenary. He again, sought his fortune in West Indies, Ireland, Russia, Afghanistan, and Punjab. So they made their way around, so this was okay. And so these are some colorful characters, who were employed by the various kings and nawabs. Okay. Another one was, now this may come as a surprise, an Italian Jewish man was a mercenary in Persia, and he ended up fighting under the Sikhs, and again married a local person. So a lot of cultural exchange and hanky-panky that was going on at that time. Okay, and this is, was the start. By this time, the British Railways was slowly being introduced in India, and then establish a big network for the large land area subcontinent. And by 1909, the Indian network was vaster than that of Britain, because Britain is small, understandably. And this was an expensive proposition, and it cost a lot more to build railways in India. And this generated a huge profits for the British investors. Okay, and it was, again, the Indians were not allowed to invest in this thing, and even in 1920, only 2 Indians were allowed to invest in these freestanding business ventures. So it was paid by the locals, and the profits were, and you can just see the Indian businessmen wanted to participate in it, but they were obviously denied contracts went to British companies. And again, so this was a very useful way of transferring money, is that obviously, at the cost of, with the Indian labor and Indian money, the railway network came in handy. And this was the start of the railways in India. And April 1853, from Bombay to a small area in the hills. And this was useful for transfer of soldiers and military, and at the same time communication. So this was okay, and this is the Great Indian Punjab GIPR. Sorry, I had to forget the abbreviation. It was a private company that had guaranteed return, and obviously there were mountain range on along the coast called Western Ghats, and so it was a very engineering marvel to build tunnels, and the various enterprising investors were participating in it, and as you can just see that the Indian Railway was well got a mention in Jules Verne's famous classic Around the World in 80 Days, where it became an inspiration. You can see how he's traveling, and even this is an amusing picture that you can see that the railways were, the elephants were used to push the railway cart. And this is the famous Victoria Terminus. It was built in the British and European style, and that is still very much in use. It was named Victoria Terminus. Obviously, now the names of all the two entities have been changed, and it's a big railway station of 100 plus, almost 200 trains, 11 from 18 platforms. It's built in a Gothic style at 30 million pounds, and was opened in 1888. And it's still a huge number of commuter traffic is still very much in use. And part of the Victoria Terminus was still infamously pictured in the terrorism that took place in 2008 from Pakistan. This was the lone terrorist who killed a huge number of people at the railway station. And subsequently, at the same time, the target was the Jewish temple in South Bombay and the famous Taj Mahal Hotel. So they succeeded in killing 57 people. Okay, and so that was the Indian 9/11 from 2008. Okay, so I think we should probably stop here. We've talked for almost 2 hours and covered about the same number of slides, and we'll talk about the Indian civil service and the mutiny next time around. So I will stop the recording and